Stippling, a quick and easy way to create textures, lighting, and the illusion of gradients. And until very, very, very recently, I'd never done it before. For real, as a fairly new painter in the hobby, any time I'd given it a rough go, well, I may as well have just brushed over it like normal in honesty. But I finally took the time to sit down and actually try getting to know stippling. And I can tell you with confidence, but I learned a few things that I want to share with you, and it's definitely a skill worth having. What I can't tell you with confidence is that I nailed it right away, because of course I didn't. Anyone who knows this channel or me knows that I try things out before doing any research. Anyways, as usual, I documented the process and have a fair bit to say on the matter, which I'll summarize at the end of the video, particularly for my fellow inexperienced painters out there. So, grab yourself a drink or something and let us see what I discovered about this process. Let us jump back to the beginning. For my first ever attempt, I grabbed myself an old empty sprue. I like keeping them around for reasons such as this. I gave it a quick prime, and while that was drying off, I scouted out my brushes for a stippling candidate. What little I knew at this point suggested that brushes don't like stippling very much because it damages the tip, so it's best to use an older, scabbier brush. So I had plenty of brushes to choose from then. Okay, wait up. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I should probably explain what exactly stippling is for those who don't know. Stippling is, in its simplest form, making loads of dots on a surface. These dots will pile up the more you apply, and eventually, if done correctly, they form the illusion of a gradient. This can be used as a relatively quick way to make a smooth transition between colors, but it can do more than that. It can also be used to imply texture to a human glance. I've seen painters make leathery textures and worn-out metals. It's really cool. Oh, and speaking of metals, stippling can even be used to make the illusion of a surface-reflecting light without any actual metallic paints in sight. Pretty cool. Oh, that smells about done. So with my sprue canvas ready, I decided to make a gradient between two colors, red and orange. I painted the two colors back to back right up against each other, then jumped right in, stippling with that same orange onto the red. At this point, I'd mixed the orange with some water, perhaps about 2 parts orange paint, 1 part water. I had very little on my brush for this attempt, and I won't lie, it was frustratingly slow. And as you can probably see, the point on my brush did not want to stick around, but despite all that, I was definitely seeing a gradient. A smoky, dirty one, but a gradient nonetheless. Though I could also see a line, you know, that line between orange and red, and I realized as I was trying to gradient over it, make it disappear, I was pushing the orange further along into the red. So I reset, painting over it red once more, but further back, to see if I could balance it out, you know? And on my second attempt, I'd say it worked out pretty well. I covered about the same distance though, from one color to another, about a centimeter. And it still had that smoky look. Sure, it may not be smooth, but there's a lot one could do with a super textured finish like this. Definitely something looking worn out, you know? Maybe flames, but that may be the color talking. Now, I wanted to try to rein in that centimeter distance, so I tried again with new colors, dark green to light green. This time, I wouldn't bother painting on any light green to start with. I just started stippling light onto dark. The end result was still reaching out a little further than I intended, but less so than the first one. And the smoothness of the gradient was a little better, despite using the same paint-to-water ratio. So while still not being perfect, I was excited. So I busted out old unfinished Termiel to give him a quick bout of stippling, just on his forearm there. Long story short, it didn't do much. I mean, it didn't do nothing, but it didn't do much. I guess I was jumping the gun and had yet to acquire the right technique for such an attempt. I went back to the sprue and decided to attempt it again, but with colors much closer together on the color wheel. Those being Macragge Blue and Thousand Suns Blue. With this one, the gradient was much smoother. I know it's kinda obvious being said out loud, but clearly, the more similar the two colors are, the easier they are to blend together, and vice versa. Being an eager fellow once again, I decided to put this apparent revelation into practice. I grabbed one of my unfinished Sons of Artifacts of Space Marines and decided to try some red to orange stippling on his pauldron. Their shoulders aren't usually that color, but I'm sure this little dude's willing. After a nice solid base of Evil Sun's Scarlet, I started dotting it up with Wild Rider Red. After a bit of tug-of-warring with how far in one direction or another it goes, I was left with what I felt was actually a pretty decent, if subtle, gradient. One thing I'd realized and very quickly came to like about stippling was the fact that if you did go too far in one direction, you could use the other color to then kind of push it back from the other direction, so you weren't necessarily locked in if you went too far. It could have been a total fluke, but each time I applied any stippling, I felt it was getting just that little bit smoother, that little bit cleaner. I still have a ways to go, but it's a promising start. While I had this fella to hand, I decided to try something else. I gave a specular gradient a go, i.e. light being reflected off his legs. Just to see how it turned out, I started with a stripe of Corax white before stippling it outwards. I'll be honest, he's got a hell of a bright light shining on his leg. From, like, right next to his leg. I quickly tried again on his other leg, this time without that starting stripe. It looks much better in my opinion, much less glaringly obvious, I guess you could say. As I went around the model just doing other bits for practice, it was becoming only more clear that I needed to find a way to gain more control over the texture. Although having said that, this current finish was actually making the metal look somewhat battered. Pretty cool in its own right, and it may even look good when applied with that in mind. Yet, even with these shortcomings, I felt positive. In pursuit of said texture control, I decided to try stippling, but with a sponge. I mean, surely there was no way it would come out like stippling with a brush, after all. I got to work applying orange onto black. Now, the results of this were a smoother blend than I anticipated, but it had some caveats. For one, it was tough to get it to reach a decent opacity near the middle of the orange section, and the paint from the sponge had a tenacity to cling to the edges of the sprue rather than the middle there. And of course, it wasn't as smooth as I believe paintbrush stippling could achieve. But I concluded that this method could work in certain situations to make a blend between two colors using a third color between the two. The next thing I tried was seeing just how far I could push stippling in a gradient between two very opposing colors, i.e. Ulthuan Grey directly onto the black. Was it possible to get a blend between them? Honestly, no it wasn't, at least not at my skill level. So I decided to see if I could build it up from multiple layers. I hit up the black with some Eshin Grey, then hit that up with some Dawnstone. There's no mistaking it. If one wants a smoother transition, one has got to build up some layers of color. Again, pretty obvious, but I like to test these things for myself, as I think we all should. So the next test I did was blending two meeting colors together using a third color. And that wasn't all I did differently. I also changed the paint to water ratio. Rather than 2 parts paint, 1 part water, it was now a 50-50 split. Guys, the difference was night and day. At least from my perspective. It was a much smoother gradient than my previous attempts. Still not perfect, but that was to be expected as stippling is not about perfection, it's about speed. Glazing is for perfection. Anyways, it was from these attempts that I believe I was able to nail down some of the key aspects and components of this technique for me to work with. A 50-50 paint to water ratio seems good. If one wants more of a rough texture, change the ratio to favor paint. The closer the colors are to each other on the color wheel, the easier they are to blend with stippling. Stippling takes more distance along the model than one may expect. It can work between two colors, from a single color or a third color blending between two. And lastly, stippling hates your brushes. So, with these pointers laid out for myself, I then went out across the internet and did actual research on stippling to see how much my discoveries lined up with the general pro-consensus of stippling, and you know what? Not to blow my own trumpet or anything, but I think I was pretty spot on. Well, with my conclusions anyway, maybe not with my noob-ass results to show for it. But I have to quickly say that of all the stippling videos I went over, I think Zumikito Miniatures was my favorite. A good blend of informative and entertaining. This beautifully bearded fellow clearly knows his shit, and I aspire to be as skilled myself someday, so you should check his video out after this one. So, with what I'd practiced thus far and with advice from various skilled painters, it's time for another shot. This time on a nicely black-primed 50mm base. Let's see if we can get a nice, smooth gradient out of stippling. Here we go. Sensible duo color selection. Check. Third color for blending. Check. 50-50 paint to water ratio. Check. An understanding that the stippling may reach further than I anticipate. Check, I guess. A brush I want to abuse. Check. Okay, let's do this. Well, gods be damned. This is looking mighty fine. Now, for real, to be ultra critical of myself, I think I may have gone past the sweet spot, if you would, and actually done a bit too much. But regardless, I'm very pleased with these results. It seems my above points, 50-50 paint to water ratio, learning to anticipate how far the stippling will reach, choosing colors wisely, etc., really does make a world of difference. And with that done, now I just need to do one thing. Practice. Keep trying and trying, refine my technique until I'm able to consistently and reliably stipple with the best of them. And ultimately, that's just it, guys. Strive to understand the technique and practice. Those are the two core pillars of this hobby, in my humble and thus far limited opinion. Aim for your best and never give up, and with time and the aforementioned practice, you will get there. And hopefully, I'll see you there. I hope this video helped give you confidence as a new painter to try it for yourself, and if you're an experienced painter, please comment down below how I could improve. It's advice from the comments that truly teach me, after all. If you enjoyed this, please do consider a like, comment, subscribe, maybe support the channel on YouTube memberships, Patreon, and of course please do join the channel Discord. I'm Artifexus, and remember, the Emperor is always guiding your brush.